Hi, I'm Keith McCullough, and welcome to another Real Conversation. You're in for a treat here. It's her first time on Hedgeye TV, and I've had more feedback. I just told Judy this, more feedback on this pending appearance than most, and that's saying something because we've had a lot of real conversations. But thank you for making the time, and congrats on your new book.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be with you, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Thanks, Keith.
It's let's just start with. I mean, we're going to make sure with all of our eye candy that people know who you are and whatnot. You've had a long history, just doing a lot of different things, but you hadn't written a book in a while. Why did you choose this time to write a book with gold on the title?
I think after having gone through the nomination process to serve as a governor at the Federal Reserve, it kind of clarified for me what's at stake, what's worth fighting for. And I felt like I'm just going to double down on the idea that money should be trustworthy. I think that money is meant to be a reliable tool. And I think people deserve sound finances and sound money from the government. So I decided to write about that, not just as a intellectual exercise, but also to kind of cross that nexus between theory and reality and try to put forth a concrete proposal that I think would begin to put us on the path to at least setting a marker for sustainable finances going out into the future with our federal budget, and as a way to assure people that the ultimate goal should be to have sound money and to make the dollar the most trusted currency in the world.
Well, it's indeed what most of us, if we live in America, we get paid in. I have a hard time, and friends of yours that are common to me as friends, like Hankey, for example, Steve Hankey, who's been on Hedgeye TV. A lot of people understand the purchasing power of the dollars that they earn, right? I mean, can you go through the most basic definition of how you talk about that? Because a lot of people like me, we're kind of not interested in people saying that, what Judy Shelton says is outdated because it has gold or something. It's nonsense. From a practical perspective, the purchasing power of the people is one of the most important things.
Well, I guess you could say I have a back to the future approach. Because I think that there's something really wrong with official central bank policy that seeks to deliberately debase the money unit of the country every year by 2%. I mean, let alone the fact that the Fed hasn't hit that and really went beyond the mark and keeps claiming it's accountable for price stability. I didn't see anyone get fired for 9% inflation. I don't really see anyone taking responsibility, not just for what that did to the purchasing power of people who have to use the dollar, that's our legal tender, but just the psychological aspect as well. How do people plan? And so I think we need to look at prior monetary systems and see what was good about it. And there were some very good things. You might even say futuristic or ultra-democratic aspects of the classical international gold standard. You could redeem the currency for gold. That was at the option of the individual. Even under the Bretton Woods international monetary system, you had fixed exchange rates among the trading partners all around the world, our allies, and they had to keep their currencies within a 1% fixed exchange rate with the dollar. And then the dollar was convertible into gold, but only if you were a foreign central bank. Then you could collect on it. So I'm talking about setting up a situation where you could redeem a U.S. Treasury security either at the face amount at maturity or in a pre-specified amount of gold. In a way, you could say it's very radical. Oh, it's a throwback. We haven't had any link to gold in 53 years. Other people might say it's no big deal. It's no big deal. I think it would be a huge marker and could become a barometer of people saying, I prefer a gold-backed dollar than the fiat money that is represented by conventional Treasury securities. It would be the beginning of saying where we want to be in the future. So that's the nature of what I would propose. And it just happens to be a pretty good deal for the U.S. government because the gold we own that we're carrying at $11 billion is worth over $650 billion. So you've got over a half a trillion in a potential windfall profit. I think that could be very appealing if a government were to use that as collateral for a future bond, but take advantage. Otherwise, I mean, I know the gold we have, we're the largest gold holders in the world with 261 million ounces. That's kind of the family jewels. But I think our nation is in a family emergency. And I don't want the next administration to sell it off. I want them to pledge it as collateral to the future and a United States that gets squared away on sound finances and sound money.
Yeah, the family emergency, let's spend some time on that, because we'll hear like outrageous comments by people who are actually perceived to be experts. I wouldn't name names like Austin Goolsbee or somebody like that, but no. Calling like inflation a Hall of Fame year. And like when you think about, it's really hard for people to watch the presidential debate, understand how enraging inflation is and how front center it is at that level, and then the Federal Reserve and all of Wall Street say, we got disinflation. We might even have deflation. Can you talk about the cumulative pain? Like when you say family emergency, a lot of families are really struggling with the cumulative inflation, like you said, since, unfortunately, since they didn't appoint you to the Federal Reserve.
Well, the cumulative effect is to, over a relatively short period of time, certainly since January of 2021, to have the general price level go up over 20%. But I'm looking at even beyond that. Let's say the Fed were to get down to 2% inflation, and let's say another administration comes in for 8 years. Well, 8 years at 2% inflation, it's still going to be 20 or 16% higher. That's significant. That's on top of what we just had. And right now, the last CPI reading came in at 2.5%. So now you're looking at another 20%. And administrations come and go, and people feel it. Think if you buy a house and you hold it for 10 years, and there's 2% inflation, and you sell it at a 20% higher nominal price after 10 years, you didn't really gain a thing. Mm-hmm. There was no profit in that, but you're going to pay tax on the capital gain. And I just think it's I don't see why government has to skim purchasing power 2% a year. And I don't see how you can rationalize making people pay capital gains taxes on purely inflation-caused nominal gains.
Yeah, I mean the whole game inside of the game for people who understand it is to own inflation. Right? And unfortunately, the large majority of Americans don't know how to do that. Right? So they end up owning a 60-40 portfolio, and they got wrecked by bonds when inflation went to 9%. By the way, can you guys show that slide 26? Apologies, I'm losing my voice today for some reason. But so this is what Judy's talking about. Like you have this cumulative inflation. The Fed said it was transitory. Instead of 2, it went to 9 on a monthly basis. Those are quarterly, of course, inflation numbers. And then it came down to 2.5, as she said. And we actually have it, and I wonder what you think about this, Judy, but we have inflation in our nowcast, which is far more accurate than most. We have it going back up into next year, no matter who the president is.
Well, that's kind of ironic. I mean, here you have the Federal Reserve talking now about rate cuts. Now, I'm on record. I would have stopped raising after we hit 4.25% to 4.5%. That was back in December 2022, because I don't think the Fed can finesse any of this. I would like to bring market signals back into the pricing for the cost of capital, instead of it just being decided by a small committee that meets 8 times a year in Washington. But that's kind of what I'm going for, that idea that you really need to let, in an economy where the most important price is the cost of capital, you need to let market forces be deciding that. We have this concept that the Fed is a committee of wise men, and it's the captain would be the chairman, Jerome Powell. And we have this image that somehow he's steering an airplane, and he banks to one side when he's fighting inflation, and he banks to the other side when he's worried about labor market conditions. So that's what he calls the balance of risks. But what it really comes down to is look at the mechanics. Look at how the Fed implements its monetary policy decisions. The decision is going to be, do we keep paying banks 5.4% to keep money just sitting there, sterile, cash on deposit at the Fed? Well, they've already said, no, we're going to cut it 25 basis points. So now they're going to go to 5.15 interest rate. That's a very generous interest rate payment. But what the Fed is really doing is they're just keeping corralled all the excess liquidity that the Fed itself created. I think it was an ill-conceived program, but they bought up $4.5 trillion worth of Treasury debt and mortgage-backed securities between March 2020 and March 2022. Then they started raising interest rates at a very steep pace. And all 11 times that they implemented those rates, it was by changing the administered rate, which is what they pay not just on the reserve balances of commercial banks, so that's the bulk of it, but also they set up the reverse repurchase agreements. And that was a way for hedge funds to park cash. Bottom line is that is money not going into the real economy. Mm-hmm. So that is a way, to me, that is like the government paying farmers not to grow crops, or it's like providing fiscal transfers to people who don't work. It's not productive. It's just the way the Fed corrals the cash. And then everybody else in the real economy ends up having their borrowing costs go up because the banks know a good deal when they see it. And it's a very sweet arrangement to just passively let reserve balances collect a very generous rate of interest, courtesy of the Fed. And by the way, that comes out of future remittances to Treasury. So in a way, it's taxpayer paid. And I just think we need a better mechanism. Paul Volcker never used that. He had to actually engage with markets through open market operations in order to impact the interest rate.
Yeah, that's Back to the Future again by Judy Shelton. Like, yeah. You get, but market signals. Now you're talking the language of most human beings that are in the Hedgeye Nation community. They are far more convinced, with me leading the charge on that, I think, that the markets figured it out, and the Fed is going to be on a lag to that. The bond market's going to tell the Fed what to do, not the other way around. And you have this, like, what do you mean by market signals? I mean, when you went to, first of all, I want to get into that too, like how the heck they didn't appoint you. Oh, I know what the answer is, but did you start with things like that? You guys need to go back to market signals. Is that how you put it on the table?
I would say, for me, I mean, I go way back. In the mid-'80s, I was a senior research fellow out at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. I was there for about 10 years. But I decided to focus on the Soviet Union's internal monetary and budgetary situation, and just started analyzing those conditions in what was going to be a very dry study called The Impact of Western Capital on the Soviet Economy. But the more I looked at the way that economy worked and the role of the ruble in that economy, I came to a conclusion that I didn't believe at first, but I just kept verifying it. And it was that the country was going bankrupt. And basically, it was because the government intervention, not just in the whole economy, but then in covering it up, running a deficit, because they weren't generating enough productive activity to provide real revenues. They were just paper revenues to the government that were then recycled as paper credits to companies. And it became a way for the industries to just engage with government, but lose their connection to what consumers might actually want to buy. So I guess my mindset maybe goes back to that. I don't want to see that happen. My book that came out after the coming Soviet crash, that came out in January '89, was called Money Meltdown. Mm-hmm. And it was called How to Restore Order to the Global Currency System. So that came out in '94. And that coincided with the 50-year anniversary of the Bretton Woods system. And what I tried to say is the only really logical platform for international trade and for monetary stability, both domestically and internationally, is to have a level monetary playing field. I admire people in the financial business who can outsmart the Fed. You guys are brilliant and you see what's coming. But I kind of feel badly for people who don't have financial assets,
Yes.
who aren't already rich. I remember once Ben Bernanke was criticized for having a 2% inflation target and making it official. It used to be behind the scenes, making it official. And someone said, well, why shouldn't it be zero? Why shouldn't, doesn't price stability mean zero inflation? What you're talking about is inflation stability, kind of an oxymoron. And his response, which I thought was kind of a little bit cold, was, well, sure, if you keep your money under your mattress. Well, some people aren't so sophisticated, or they really don't want to take the risk of investing the money. Or for so many years after 2008, even if they were responsible enough to put a little aside every week for retirement at the bank, they got zilch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they made monetary policy, it plays favorites, and it can make suckers out of savers. And I think when you undermine this basic virtue of capitalism, which is people saying, I could consume what I've earned, but I'm going to put some away. And that's going to become the seed capital for a greater future harvest. And I think you have to make that make sense and pay off. And when you misprice assets, when you give the wrong signals on what is a productive investment, when you make it more profitable to game a dysfunctional system than to really help financial resources flow to their optimal use, I think you're not only undermining the prospects for prosperity, but I think you're doing a great disservice to the morality of a free market system where individuals have property rights and where there's rule of law. I think we should apply that to the unit of account, to the money of the United States. That's your property. And I think it deserves to be dependable and trustworthy, and you can feel secure in making future plans without having to listen to financial news stations all day long. Some people actually go out and work for a living. So I want the money to work for them.
You know, I that really resonates with me. I was raised in a blue collar family. I don't talk Marxist class. We just didn't have as much money as what we would affectionately call the elites these days. But my mom and dad are retired. My dad's 38 years retired from the fire department. You know, he doesn't pay attention to this, but he really needs that money, you know, to work for him. And I just think about that, like, relative to what I also said to you, which is, well, you know, those of us who know what we're doing, you know, we just own inflation, right? If you can't see inflation, then it's not in your account. I mean, so, and that is a real push-pull in my mind, like from a moral perspective, and you just touched on that. So thank you for doing that, because most people don't have the courage to just call it like it is.
Well, thank you for saying that. I see it as a moral issue. I will say probably my proudest moment during the nomination hearing before the Senate Banking Committee was when I was asked, is there anything you really want to say? This time we won't give you a leading question. What do you want to say? And I said, I want to say that I view money as a moral contract between citizens and the government. And I think it's incumbent on the government to provide a meaningful unit of account and a dependable store of value. Mm-hmm. And that's just where I start and end on that matter.
Well, I think, I mean, you know, for me, I mean, we built our business on 3 principles: transparency, accountability, and trust. And you hit on that trust point. If the people don't trust, and they don't, I'd say that we're probably, for as long as I've been doing this, which is almost a quarter century, I guess, is we're the furthest to the distrust line, if you had it in terms of the spectrum that I've seen, that we've ever had. And that's fully loaded with leaks. You know, government data that the entire market's trading on is constantly being leaked to the elites. It's being leaked to these establishment agencies. You don't know who they are, but there's no rule of law surrounding that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes. Actually, I was criticized. I'm not really carrying any grievance about that process. I actually think that it was actually wonderful and did help help me clarify some things that I would like to stand up for.
I think it probably saved your life, honestly. I mean, I can't imagine working with those 20,000 people at the Federal Reserve. I mean, that would be the end of it for me.
Well, yeah, actually, at the Federal Reserve, the ratio of Democrat economists to Republican is 10-1. So I don't know if the corporate culture would have been very comfortable for me. But I think that what I was criticized for was saying that I think we need to scrutinize some of the data that comes from government agencies. And some people responded, well, how dare she? She's questioning information that is coming straight from the government. And I wasn't really suggesting there was anything nefarious in it. I just think that some of these surveys, you see such a huge disparity with the payroll numbers and then the household survey and JOLTS. And you start to say, when you see these massive revisions, it's almost laughable that we had people commenting prior to Federal Reserve meetings, oh, this is, I got within 10,000. I very accurately predicted where it would be. Therefore, the Fed is going to do thus and thus. And then you find out, oh, no, it was hundreds of thousands off over a cumulative period. And I think that we might be misdiagnosing what's happening in the economy in general. I think it's very important to get a better handle on the impact of migrant labor. And I think that affects productivity numbers. I think a lot of people who are actually working, that might be counted as jobs, but if people are concerned about their legal status, they might not report that when they're responding to surveys from the government about their business plans. I don't know, but I think that we need to get better statistics about the impact of these dynamic changes in the economy before we make pronouncements about why we see strong consumer demand, why we see strong economic growth. If you remember when Chair Powell announced in August 2022 at the Jackson Hole meeting that, well, now we're going to fight inflation and it's going to be rough. He basically said that households and businesses will suffer because, as the Fed's model knows for certain, if you have to curtail economic activity, and you do that by raising rates. And so that's going to end up causing higher unemployment and lower growth. Well, when that didn't happen, I thought, first off, why are they missing all the impact of the fiscal transfers? Here's the Fed running a restrictive monetary policy to constrain economic activity when the government is running a massive fiscal stimulus program. And so working against each other, and the net effect of that was to shift power from the private sector. In the private sector, the higher borrowing rates were a true obstacle. Yep. I mean, people who wanted to expand their business or hire more people, they couldn't get over that high wall of increased borrowing costs. But the government launched its programs. It doesn't care what the borrowing cost is. Treasury goes to the auction. Treasury pays whatever rate they have to borrow the funds. And then you see it show up, sure, as people point to, we're spending over $1 trillion, over $1.1 trillion, more than we spend on defense or whatever other big category you might come up with. And the government just attaches that to the future budget predictions. They don't actually do anything about it. So, and they don't really want to. I mean, the government has no incentive. They want to just count it as GDP, all the government workers or all the health care or other services related to government spending, count that as GDP and just dismiss the fiscal aspect. But I wonder if the government launched tomorrow universal basic income and started sending checks to everybody to spend more, it could show up as higher GDP and strong consumer spending, but there is no interest rate that the Fed could set to combat that. That's going to still put spending power in people's pockets. That's going to put pressure on consumer prices for goods and services. So you can't have uncoordinated monetary and fiscal policy and have any kind of a strategic plan for improving the U.S. economy.
It's and well done on attacking that line, like in terms of, well, we need to actually look at the data. I mean, there's that at a very basic level, and then there's the process of analyzing the data. I mean, guys, go to the deficit, just because Judy hit on it. Slide 120, 128. The CBO projections on the deficit was off by $360 billion in 4 months. I mean, like, Americans know this, Judy. Like the nowcast, our inflation nowcast. Actually, Hanky. Now that I'm pumping Hanky's tires twice here, he'll love that. Hanky front ran me on the inflation because we run like a real-time nowcast, so I can only really get to the next 4 quarters. But he was saying, like, look, on my money supply model, we could go to 9%, and it's exactly where we went. So there are competent processes to analyze things out there, and they're very obvious to a lot of people. So how does the Fed, which is an unelected body by the people, how do these 20,000 people, get to stay with this dogmatic, broken process that never works, and the rest of us are sitting here front-running it and, like you said, making money on it, but the people aren't?
I think there's kind of an addiction, certainly in financial markets, to obsessing about the Fed. And I hear it in the questions from the mostly adoring financial journalists, right, who next Wednesday will put questions forward to the Fed chairman. And I don't think they will ask, for example, Mr. Chairman, since you started raising interest rates through the administered rate paid particularly on reserve balances held by depository institutions at their local Federal Reserve Bank, are you aware that in 2022, starting in March through June of 2024, the Fed has paid those banks and money market mutual funds over $500 billion in interest payments to keep the money sitting in those cash accounts, which, as the Fed says, then tells banks that's your reserve rate. You're never going to make a loan to a private customer at anything less than that. And of course, the risk-free versus any potentially productive loan in the private sector has to have some element of risk. That's the basic nature of capitalism. That's how you have breakthroughs. How much of that $500 billion that the Fed has paid to private financial institutions gone to the top 5, the largest banks? How much has gone to the foreign-owned banks who also have depository accounts at the Fed? I think those would be tough questions. So for me, it's not just the direction, it's the mechanism. That has become the primary tool the Fed uses. And that's when I think you entice people to game that system. I think that when you see the carry trade, for instance, we saw what happened with the Japanese yen a few weeks ago, and it was hugely market moving. But that's how people play the game. They borrow from one central bank at 0%. They buy assets, say in Mexico, where that rate is 6%, and they're counting on a certain exchange rate among those currencies. Now we see that currency competition is really conducted through the differential interest rate policies of the world's major central banks. And if people suddenly get caught, because in this case, Japan started to take a different path on monetary policy, it's hugely disruptive to markets around the world. And this to me is symptomatic of having no monetary system, a non-monetary system in the world. Or as a friend of mine, Jacques de la Rosière, who was formerly head of the Banque de France, who was also the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. He's in his 90s now. He calls what we have today worse than a non-system. It's an anti-system. Mm-hmm. He thinks that it totally rewards people on financial assets, creates a false sense of wealth, and is uniquely vulnerable to reality suddenly kicking in and having some kind of meltdown. And precisely because there is no rational approach, I think, either on domestic monetary policy, but I don't see how you can have domestic monetary stability, especially if you're the world's reserve currency, without taking into consideration international monetary stability. And I believe even the focus on tariffs these days is because of this non-level international monetary playing field. What people sometimes forget is the United States became a champion for free trade only after the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement was put into place, which set up this stable monetary platform where you had fixed exchange rates. It was 2 years later that Congress agreed to become a member of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Because, as we should remember from the 1930s, and this is why I go back and look at history and the impact of different monetary systems, it was the race to the bottom. When a country tried to gain an unfair trade advantage by depreciating its currency in the 30s, the response was tariffs. That was to even the price, to level the playing field for competition. And then the tariffs set off countries wanting to depreciate more to get that price advantage against domestic producers so they could export to those countries. And we may be seeing now, it looks like the cart before the horse. But for instance, if we put tariffs on China, I expect China to depreciate their currency.
Yeah.
And then I think that would deserve accusations from the United States of currency manipulation. They were officially charged with that in August of 2019. But when they started to get a little better, that was lifted a few months later. But I can see us going into the same tit for tat, and it's a dangerous one. There are many people who believe that what happened in the 30s with the currency war situation led to the real war. And the solution for that was when the US came up with this idea of the Bretton Woods approach. And the reason we devised it was actually to encourage our allies who were still fighting the war against Nazism to believe there was something worth fighting for, that they would not be going back to the 30s if we could ever get victory, that the US was introducing something fundamentally new that would provide a stable monetary platform for reconstructing their economies, for fostering efficient use of financial capital, and that everyone would benefit. And as it turned out, everybody did. In France, they called it the glorious 30 years, the Bretton Woods years. It was a wonderful time. In the United States, we had declining wealth inequality. We had greater participation in the workforce. We had strong economic growth, and more importantly, productive economic growth. So I think those are values or goals worth pursuing, and I do not think it's coincidental. I think they absolutely coincided with that era, roughly 30 years, of when the world had a stable monetary platform for trade and investment.
You had, I mean, you had both. I say it all the time, but I mean, periods of strong dollar have been, to your point, in terms of equality on most scores, happiness, confidence. Whether you look at the Reagan years or you look at the Clinton years, you had a strong dollar, you had very weak cost of things. Oil was below $20 in both periods, and that's just a different world. I mean, today everyone just wants to get paid. The people that get the game, they just want to get paid, and the people that have to pay the price are the people. And it's kind of, you and I know this, but it can be frustrating that on the one hand, I can advise trillions of dollars under assets under management that absolutely agree with that, or they wouldn't pass, right? For our nowcast, where's inflation going? Where's growth going? What is the impact of money supply? Like, you can have us, doing that, and on the other side, they can just, not appoint Judy Shelton. They can keep getting paid at the Federal Reserve. It's a safe job to all them, and that, I think, there's got to be a breaking point. We don't know, obviously, what that breaking point is. Do you have a way that, like, I hate this question because I hate getting asked it, but how does it, how does it end?
Well,
The game. front running the Fed, everybody getting paid on that.
What I'm suggesting in the book, first, the book is in two parts. And part one is kind of, can we reach consensus? And I posed three major points. Can we reach consensus that central planning doesn't work? And I can go through the Soviet example and other examples of industrial policy by governments. I think we should be able to agree central planning doesn't work as well as free market forces and individuals doing things they perceive in their own interest. I believe in that invisible hand. Can we agree that stable money fosters productive economic growth? I think we've seen that because we see inflated assets, we see vulnerability to meltdowns, we see that financial profits aren't necessarily the ones that generate greater prosperity, that bring about the research and development, that underpin entrepreneurial creativity, so that you get new products that raise the standard of living for whole societies. I think that's more important than just looking at GDP numbers that include an increasing amount of financialization of the economy. So that's second. Third, I think we need money that works across borders and through time. Certainly I want it to be dependable, but sometimes I think people think, oh, well, that's a little too extreme. I mean, that's the real throwback to the classical international gold standard. You had a unified currency where every country could say, we define our money unit and in terms of this specific weight of a common reference benchmark, which was gold or silver. It doesn't have to be gold, but I think to myself, it is historically recognized. It's universal. Almost all major central banks hold sums of it. And maybe I'll inject here a little aside. During the nomination process, at one point that was very, maybe I'll say brutal, opinion piece by a columnist in the Washington Post about why I was a dangerous pick. And it said, well, she speaks language about sound money, which is, she's whispering to the crank right-wing fringe when she says that, because she's referring to gold standard type systems. So I actually sent that, I emailed that column to Alan Greenspan, who's been a colleague for 30 years. He liked my Soviet book, sent me a note when it came out, or I guess it was in 1990, said, stop by sometime. And after that, I would say 3 or 4 times a year, both when he was chairman and after he had his private consulting service, we got together, including after I'd been put forward as a nominee. So I emailed that column to him, and I had a message that said, there seems to be a certain hysterical antagonism about the gold standard. Well, that was the first line of an article Alan Greenspan wrote, published in 1966 as an Ayn Rand acolyte, where it was called Gold and Economic Freedom. And he said in a very radical essay that people who are against it are welfare statists who only believe in redistribution of income. And so he talked up the virtues of being on a gold standard. So he emailed back a little bit later that day, and I remember exactly what he wrote. He said, if gold is such a useless metal, why does the US government and all the major governments of the world hold so much of it in storage? And I thought, I wish I could show these pundits who think that talking about gold and as a bulwark for monetary strength is somehow beneath the people who have really been in the arena. Paul Volcker, we talked regularly about the role of gold every year at a conference I co-chaired with Robert Mundell in Italy. And of course, Volcker understood that. He was with Nixon in August of 1971. He always thought we would temporarily, because the US had overspent and caused inflation in the dollar. He thought we would temporarily close the gold window, revalue it. Maybe instead of $35 per ounce of gold, we could go up as high as 39, maybe 42. Well, they could never catch up. So by February 1973, the Smithsonian Agreement ended it once and for all. And that's why the dollars the US holds are valued at $42 per ounce. We carry them as being worth 11 billion total, our 261 million ounces. But Paul Volcker never bought into that idea that it made sense to have inflation, even at a low rate. He said 2 or 3%, it might be low, but it's inflation nonetheless. He said, I don't understand. This was in his final book before he passed away. It was called The Quest for Sound Money and Good Government. Well, that was the subtitle. The title was Keeping at It by Paul Volcker. Great book. But he says in that book, if you're debasing the country's money unit by 2 or 3% every year, he said that's violating the efficacy and the morality of controlling the money. And he said, my mother would see through that. And I just loved it. His point is that the average person can see through it. When the decision was made unofficially at the Fed to have a 2% inflation target, that was in July of 1996. And Greenspan said, let's discuss what it means to have our mandate be stable prices. And Janet Yellen was on the board. Greenspan said, why doesn't that mean zero inflation? I think stable prices means that, not stable inflation. She said, she made the argument, the very Keynesian argument, that, well, money illusion is important for people's state of mind. And if you have a 2% or 3% inflation rate, and you need to cut workers' wages by 1% because of an economic contraction, you could still give them a raise nominally of 1 or 2%, but you actually reduced their wages. And she cited a survey which said, we asked workers, if you got a 2% raise and inflation was 2%, would you still be happy? And most of them, not all of them, said, yeah. Of course, I understand that because it's tough to go and keep renegotiating a cost of living increase in your salary. So they said they'd be reasonably happy. But then she said, and it's in the transcripts from that FOMC meeting, she said, looking at all the central bankers around the table at the Fed, you'll be happy to know that we also gave that survey to economists and said, if you got a 2% raise, but there was 2% inflation, would you be satisfied? They said, no, we would not. And then it shows parenthetically there was laughter around the table. And I just think that shows the mindset of an economic elite that thinks we're smart enough to know that a nominal increase in our wages may not make up for the loss in purchasing power, but the average Joe doesn't think like us.
Yeah, there's only one way that a banker who didn't found the bank becomes a billionaire, Jamie Dimon. So I mean, that we know who got paid. You know, everybody knows who's getting paid, and I keep coming back to that. But I wonder if you agree with this, because I find that I've never heard anyone say it the way you did, which is, and maybe people don't know that, but now they know. You know, this back and forth between you and Greenspan, you know, the agreement of Volcker, obviously. I think most people would probably know that. They probably don't know about Greenspan in 1966. But if you take that body, guys, if you show the debt against that timeline, because my point here is that it's been both Republican and Democrat since basically coming out of the 2021 recession. It's been Bernanke, number one, number two, Yellen, and now you have Powell. But Bernanke was the real deal. I mean, he devalued the dollar to a 40-year low, and the guy wouldn't even mention it. You know, like, so we have in this chart, that's when, Judy, you could see that, sorry, go to the next one. You could see that's the deficit, by the way. People should know that one, but go to the next chart. There is a hockey sticking under that period. And then now the future is like, just round numbers, 97% to 172% is where the debt's going to be. I mean, is there any way to take it back?
Well, the most promising way is to simultaneously increase growth and cut spending. I'm really, really enthused about the notion of putting Elon Musk on a efficiency commission. I know that waste, fraud, and abuse is sometimes a cliche when you don't know exactly what you're looking for. But when you see increases in fiscal transfers, suddenly it goes up, say that for disability. People who genuinely have disabilities, I'm a bleeding heart. All right, I understand that as a nation, you have levels of care for your fellow citizens. But I think there is fraud. I think there are transfers, fiscal transfers that give people subsidies on housing and education and childcare and food. Some may be deserving, but as Senator Phil Gramm pointed out in a very important book in the last couple of years, if you can figure out how to collect on those kinds of programs, you can have the equivalent of an $80,000 a year job, and your only job is really to keep qualifying to collect. I think that's extremely demoralizing for people who work hard every day to try to get that kind of salary and then pay taxes on it. And they see that, they start to think, why am I doing it? Mm-hmm. How do you restore that effort or the connection between effort and reward? So I think we need to weed out the wasteful spending. And then one thing we've seen, growth helps a lot. Growth solves a lot of problems, but I want it to be real growth. And people then might say, well, you're willing to have a higher deficit to cut taxes? Yes, I am. I think there's a difference between running a deficit aimed at incentivizing working, saving, and investing to have a future higher level of prosperity in your economy that will generate increased revenues to the government than to be running a deficit that's based on redistributing current output for current consumption. I think that's just eating yourself up. So I am for a pro-growth supply side economic agenda that keeps taxes low, that reduces the regulatory burden on individuals and companies. I mean, let's have cost benefit analysis. I liked what was done under the Trump administration, cutting regulations 2-for-1 or 10-to-1 for every new one you put on. I think that's extremely important. I think smart energy policy, that's always been part of the supply side approach, and savvy trade policy. I understand national security considerations are important, and I think they've become increasingly important. In the days when Trump was first running in 2016, I was intrigued by the fact that he talked about currency manipulation, because I'd been talking about that since Money Meltdown and the need for an orderly currency system. I'd been concerned about having trade with countries who deliberately depreciate their currency since '94. So I was intrigued that he talked about it. But I remember when he called himself a free trader, he just said it has to be fair. Now, I don't think you can correct for everything. I don't think you can correct for all labor conditions or environmental controls or some of the things that maybe Bernie Sanders talks about as unfair trade practices by our trading partners. I'm not sure how you address cheaper labor rates because that kind of goes to comparative advantage and what we like to think about as the wealth of nations. But I do think that it's very straightforward to show currency depreciation. I don't even think you need to call it manipulation, because then a country will say, well, we had to do this monetary wise because you did that monetary wise. That's why I say gold is really the neutral arbiter of all that. If you look at the currencies of our top 5 trading partners, so that's the Mexican peso, the Canadian dollar, the euro, the Chinese yuan, and the Japanese yen. If I look at those currencies over the last 10 years relative to the US dollar, how they have depreciated relative to this neutral reference point, gold, they all have been debased more than the dollar. Now we know the dollar has lost value relative to gold. We see gold going up. But if you did that same thing, looking at the starting prices 10 years ago to now, for those 5 currencies, our trading partners, they debased more.
Yeah.
So you could say, so maybe that justifies a tariff on a no blame basis. You just say, that's it. There has been, and we don't know if you were trying to cause it. All we know is that your currency, and you're in charge of it, we presume, has lost value relative to ours. That has given you a price advantage when you export to us. I think they need our markets more than we need them. I think there was a real hollowing out of our manufacturing capability. And at one time, it was a bipartisan issue to prevent currency manipulation. I remember that there was a Democrat senator, and she said, representing her state, Michigan, she was speaking on Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, and she said, our workers can compete against the best products, car products anywhere in the world. But in those days, she said, but we can't compete against the Bank of Japan. And so that's what I'm talking about. And that's why I think we need to talk about currencies if we're going to be talking about tariffs, because the U.S. has been a leader in setting up a stable monetary platform before. We have the world's dominant currency. I think that we are the country, the only country that can open up this debate and say, we have had prior historical instances of a level monetary playing field, and the U.S. is ready to initiate something new. But we're gonna make our dollar even more trustworthy. We're going to issue a long-term treasury bond convertible into gold at the option of the bondholder. That, I think, would be an eye-opener.
Yeah, great new ideas. I mean, and highly destabilized. When they say, "Oh, that would be destabilizing," yes, to the establishment and all of their largesse, their political power, and their riches. But I don't care. And my colleague Neil Howe, I don't know if you're familiar with Neil or you've ever had conversations with him, who wrote The Fourth Turning. Do you know Neil by chance?
No, I'd like to.
but the fourth turning is a generational, it's not theory, it's just demographics. That a generation, in this case the boomers, both parties eventually become the same thing on deficits and debt in terms of what we're talking about, and they royally screw it up, and then you have a fourth turning, the next generation, comes in. Do you think, and by the way, do you think that's, we have to wrap up here in a bit, but that could be how it plays out? I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy's like under the age of 40, right? He does not, he trusts the Fed less than you do. Obviously, he's going to be part of the Republican Party. And if Trump wins, he's going to be front center. So, right. Do you think that it takes the next generation, people like me, I'm older than him, but relatively speaking to the establishment econs out there, I'm relatively young.
I definitely do. And I think a lot of potential generational resentment is warranted. We have not been good stewards
you think?
of the U.S. financial outlook. I also would look to those same people to magnify the barometer that I'm seeking to set up. Simple initiative, actually maybe the Treasury Secretary under a Trump administration as an initiative could set up what I'm talking about, gold convertible bonds, in the same way that TIPS bonds were first auctioned in 1997, actually under Robert Rubin. Mm-hmm. And they were just offered as a new option for investors who wanted some kind of treasury security that was indexed to inflation. That's what these would be. It's just, instead of counting the loss of purchasing power in terms of the CPI and being reimbursed, you're counting the loss in purchasing power in terms of the price of gold. and having the right to convert at maturity. But I would like to see the cryptocurrency world get involved with this. So now we're talking about maybe the younger generations, because why couldn't you issue a stable coin 100% backed by these securities? Why couldn't you have private hedge funds replicate what the US Treasury security, I call them Treasury trust bonds, that's what I propose. Why couldn't they replicate that payoff by combining nominal conventional Treasury securities with a gold futures contract? So if there's demand for that instrument, and first off, I'm sure the government would be able to borrow at a much cheaper rate than they borrow through conventional Treasury securities, because they're offering this fantastic option. Might even appeal first as a novelty, but then as a real investment hedge. But let's say that you start to see that sort of security become more popular and higher demand. Then I can see, again, stablecoin issuances backed by these assets that represent a convertible into gold dollar. I also would expect to see other countries do it. Could even be China. You have the next three largest gold holding countries currently are Germany, Italy, and France. And the European Central Bank holds a lot. Of course, the IMF holds a lot. But what I'm thinking is, what if another country also put out a comparable instrument, a sovereign debt security that could be convertible into gold at some future point? Think if it was set up to the same timeline as the Treasury trust bond issued by the United States, you would have the beginnings of a future fixed exchange rate monetary system, because both of those assets at maturity would be worth the same thing, whatever is the specified amount of gold that their currency can be converted into, and that sets up inherently a fixed exchange rate between them, because now it's unified.
Yep.
And now you have the same purchasing power that is intrinsic to being a holder of either of those securities.
It's such a great idea. At the beginning, you said you're going back to the future, but that statement that you just made, we're going to clip it. I mean, that's not back to the future. That's going to the future from where we're at. And I think that's a critical point that you just made. I mean, I agree with it. If you did that, the number one thing you do is you'd reduce the rate of change of global currency volatility. Global currency volatility currently is breaking out to the upside. That perpetuates Mexican peso down 12% in 3 months, et cetera, et cetera. We have the move in the Japanese yen. Well, that happened too because we leaked more government data. Everybody in New York, Boston, and wherever, bought a bunch of bonds. Dollar went down as the Japanese said, yeah, we're going to tighten. So you can't operate in a vacuum in the future. Absolutely not. And I think that, like, of all the things that you said, it's nice that at the end of the conversation, I'd love to have another one, you got to that solution. And I can only pray at this point. I mean, prayer, it's not a risk management process, but I mean, I can only pray that this generation doesn't have some kind of a blow up before we have to clean it up. But I sincerely hope that you're on the front lines of advising all of us. It's been a fantastic conversation, so thank you for this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I think we need to bring some vision and imagination, but I think this could be pragmatic. And at the very least, it becomes an information tool in the same way that TIPS bonds give an assessment of the aggregate expectations of investors about future inflation. Treasury trust bonds would give the Fed a sense of the aggregate expectations about future exchange rates. And I think that would be extremely useful.
Well said. And good luck with the sales of your new book. If you have to buy this book, hopefully all of you have already ordered it. So thank you very much, Judy Shelton. I appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Keith. Enjoyed it.
What kind of a real conversation was that? That was awesome. I don't have a voice. I don't know what's going on, but thanks for putting up with me, and we'll see you next time.